All right, so we're going to be in 2 Samuel. We're in chapter 15. We'll go today through the beginning of 16. We're right in the middle of the life of David, towards, I guess, closer to the end of his life now. He's in a bit of a pickle at this point. It's a light way to put it. But his son, who is his third son, but the other two are out of the picture, the first two. And so Absalom, his son, is the next one in line for the kingdom. And I think Absalom, well, I guess the best way to put it is he's just too anxious to make something happen. You know, no telling what would have happened if he would have been an obedient son following the Lord and the good ways of his father in seeking God. But he was ready to put his father out and take over. And one of the reasons maybe Absalom wanted to do this is because of David's lack of justice within the family and with certain issues that needed to happen. As you know, David has committed some sins in the past that we've studied, and for whatever reason, he was too lenient and light on his children. We talked about that last week, and Absalom wanted to set things straight upon his own understanding, I guess you could say. And so he killed his brother. I think it served multiple purposes. One, put him in line for the throne, and then two, in his mind, justified the rape of his sister. And so Absalom just took the law into his own hands. And we saw last week that not only did he do that, but once he came back into Jerusalem by David's hesitancy in granting him to come and live back in Jerusalem, he began to parade himself in a political way to the people of Israel. And the people of Israel, with their lack of understanding of what was going on between Absalom and David and Absalom's real motives, they really just gave their hearts over to Absalom. We saw that all last week. I believe it was a informative message last week about what is going on. We don't have time to get into all that today, but it is online if you'd like to listen. But today what we see is Absalom about to take over the kingdom and what David has to do in response to his son taking over. And one thing I will say is, if you look at verse number 11, when Absalom went out, it says 200 men were invited from Jerusalem, and they went along innocently and did not know anything. So just keep that in mind. Absalom is building a rebellion, but the people he's building a rebellion with don't know that there's issues between Absalom and David. They just think there's going to be a transition of power here at some point because Absalom's the next one in line for the kingdom. And so they innocently go with him, is what the scripture says. And so as he took these people, it made it appear even more that he had the support of David. So what's about to happen is he's setting everything up at a certain time, and through the way the grapevine worked back then is to say that Absalom now reigns in Hebron. And whenever he says that, it spreads through Israel, and it's not time. David didn't say that he was going to be the next king, but the people, none the wiser, think, well, David must have done it, so now, hail King Absalom. And that is not what is supposed to be happening, but he's going to take it by force. And so there were a few strategic people that helped this happen, and one of them was one of David's most trusted counselors. His name was Ahithophel. And we're going to talk a little bit more about him in coming weeks, so it's kind of important to grab a hold of who he was. Absalom is David's son, like I said, in line for the kingdom if everything went the way it needed to go. But Ahithophel is a good friend, or was a very good friend of David, but something happened that separated them. I think it's David's fault. It's David's fault that they're separated. But the way that Ahithophel replies and deals with the sin that David committed isn't right either. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the message. Many times in life, you'll come across a situation where someone offends someone else, and rather than coming together and communicating about it, in this situation, David did offend Ahithophel, but Ahithophel, instead of dealing with it, left and let it fester. Let it fester and fester until it consumed him. He was a wise, godly man, but he let this incident that David did, who was known as a godly man, David shouldn't have done this, what he did. And I'll tell you in a second what he did if you don't remember. But the bottom line is Ahithophel left, and he let it fester until he was ready to do something about it and hurt David. Okay? If you're in a situation where either it's true or not that someone offended you, I believe the Bible is going to share today in two instances, this one and another one, that it's wise to go communicate with the person that you think offended you or did offend you so that the truth can be made known. And if they did offend you, like David did, and you go to them and communicate, like if Ahithophel did, maybe they would have repented before God. And if that's the case, it'll give you a chance to extend forgiveness the way that God forgave you. One thing that Ahithophel did not know is in the years that he was away because of this offense that took place, that David did, David truly was broken and repented before God. And the thing that David did is he committed adultery with Bathsheba, who was Ahithophel's granddaughter. Okay? So you can see how that would really not sit well with David. Also, because Ahithophel liked Uriah, who was Bathsheba's husband, who was also a mighty man of David. They all were together in a close friendship. And when David didn't go off to battle and he committed adultery with Bathsheba, he not only hurt Uriah, who was Bathsheba's husband, he hurt all the family around him. We talked about that before. When you sin, it doesn't just stay here. It ripples out in ways that you can't even know. And this sin with Bathsheba, years later, we're seeing that it's rippled out to the point where Bathsheba's granddad is going to do something to hurt David. Now listen, Ahithophel does not necessarily think that Absalom is a great guy, but Absalom is the guy that he can use to get back at David. You follow what I'm saying? So this rebellion that Absalom's putting on, Ahithophel, one of David's best guys, pulls back and goes and partners with Absalom to bring about this horrible thing, which we'll talk about over the next couple of weeks, and we'll see how this plays out. But understand that Ahithophel was offended, so you can see why he'd be upset with David. But if he wouldn't have gone away, and just believed what the enemy was telling him, because the enemy wants to split up godly relationships, if he wouldn't have done that, maybe forgiveness and restoration could have happened between them, and even a better relationship could have happened in the future. But that was not the case. Ahithophel let bitterness and anger and revenge, all these things come in his heart, and then it played out that way. Okay, so just giving background, I'm just going to read a lot through this, and then we'll talk about the other issue that has to do with the same thing that we're talking about right now. Anyways, let's look at chapter 15, verse number 12. It says, Then Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city, from Gilo, which he offered sacrifices. And the conspiracy grew strong, for the people of Absalom continually increased in number. So you can see the rebellion's beginning to grow and grow and grow, and now you have key people like Ahithophel in this rebellion. Some, like Ahithophel, are in there because they want to be. They have their own reasons for being in it. Others are in there because they just think it's the way it's going. They don't know any different. Okay, so verse number 13 says, And now a messenger came to David saying, The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. David's sitting in his kingdom. He knows that Absalom's gone off he thinks, to worship the Lord, but then he realizes that Absalom's making a rebellion at this point, and he hears from his people the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. They're not with you anymore, David. I think David's heart dropped at that moment, and he had to start making plans. What do I do? What kind of person is Absalom? Would he kill me? And I think David decided at that point he would easily take my life if I don't do something about it. So David had to try to decide what to do. Do I stand in Jerusalem, have a civil war happen here, and begin to fight? Do I do that, or do I try to just pack up and leave? David packs up and leaves. I think, one, because he doesn't want a big battle right in Jerusalem, and I think, two, because he doesn't want to run the risk of Absalom dying if he has to fight and kill them. It's his son. It's just better for me to leave. So he packs up his stuff. The king of Israel, for decades and decades at this point, packs up and leaves at the threat of his own son coming in and pronouncing himself as king. So that's what's happening here. And David says, verse number 14, so he said to all his servants who are with him in Jerusalem, arise, let us flee, or we shall not escape from Absalom. Make haste and depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring disaster upon us and strike the city with the edge of the sword. And the king's servant said to the king, we are your servants, ready to go and do whatever the Lord commands. Then the king went out with all his household before him, but the king left 10 women, concubines, to keep the house. So at this point, David's trying to decide what to do. He's in the moment. He has a tragic situation. He's got to respond. If he just stays there, it's untold what would happen. And without the will to fight, Absalom would probably kill them all. And he knows it, so he's like, we got to leave. So he leaves 10 concubines there to take care of the house. I don't have time to get into all that. We've spoken of it before. I don't think it's a right thing for a man to have concubines like this, obviously. But yeah, one man, one woman to be married, that's what God desires. But in the way the culture went back then, and the way King David sinned back then to take the culture into his life, he had 10 ladies that were like wives to him, but the difference is their children weren't in line for the throne. That's basically the difference in a concubine and a wife. You would treat a concubine like a wife, but their children weren't in line for the throne. So David leaves them there and says, take care of the house and make sure everything's okay here. And then he leaves with everybody else. And he says, and the king's servant said to the king, we'll do whatever you want. He left the concubines there. Verse number 17, and the king went out with all of his people after him and stopped at the outskirts. I've never been to Jerusalem. I would love to go one day and see all the things. I've studied about this, but I've studied a class. I took a class actually to really get this figured out. It's called the geography of Israel, and I studied topography and everything. Jerusalem is on a hill, and the Temple Mount, where he would have been coming from, is up on a hill as well. And when you leave this and you walk down a hill, and then you'll go across the brook Kidron at the bottom of that hill, and then you'll walk up another hill, and you're at the Mount of Olives. So what probably happened when they left is they walked out, all these people, they leave the city that they love, they go down, probably cross the brook Kidron, they probably walked up a little bit where they could turn back and look and see the city. And they just sat there and probably thought, how in the world did this happen? Like, I can't believe that we're leaving. There's King David, we're here, we're fugitives, and that's our city. Like, Absalom's coming in, and just the weight of all that was so intense. And we'll read in a minute that they wept, they cried, and they had hoods on their heads, and they walked with their heads down, and they were quiet leaving, and David was crying. So it says they stopped at the outskirts. Verse number 18, then all his servants passed before him, and all of the Cherethites and the Pelethites and the Gittites, 600 men, these are the mighty men that fought for David, from Gath, passed before the king. So the king stopped, he's crying, all of his mighty men are just walking by. They're probably feeling awkward, and they're probably feeling some rage, thinking, we could take on Absalom and kill him. We could do that. Joab's there with him, the commander of his army, and they're leaving, and they're probably confused a little bit, but they're committed to their king, and he says leave, so they're going to leave. But it is not like it for these mighty men to tuck their tails and walk away. It's not like it. So no doubt there was some stuff conflicting in their hearts. And these mighty men, we talked about it before, they were very valiant. The battles that they won were so far unbalanced in the odds of winning, they should never have won. One guy, it says, would kill 800 men. One guy, his hand clenched so hard to the sword that he couldn't even open it after killing so many people. These guys were tough, and their hoodies are on, and they're walking out of the city. David's crying, and that's the scene right here. It says, then the king said to Ittai the Gittite, this is one of the newest mighty men. He's actually only been there for a day, but he came to serve along King David, and as he walks in to serve, this happens the next day. So what's he going to do? He could have just hightailed it back home and said, well, I wasn't really a part of this thing, and now there's a weird rebellion going on. I really don't want all this. But no doubt this guy had heard about King David, and then the king said to him, why are you also going with us? This is as the men are passing by. Okay, David's crying. He looks up and he sees this guy, Ittai, that he just met yesterday. He says, return and remain with the king. For you are a foreigner and also an exile from your own place. So he says, look, you're in exile. Why don't you just go back into the city, walk right back across the brook, and go up there and remain with the king? He called Absalom the king. And then verse 20 says, in fact, you came only yesterday. Should I make you wander up and down with us today? Since I go, I know not where. So David's like, look, I don't even know where I'm going. Should I make you wander around with us? Just go be with the king. You'll be great with that guy. And then it says, return, take your brethren, and go back. Mercy and truth be with you. That's what David said to him. Verse 21, but Ittai answered the king and said, as the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, surely in whatever place my lord the king shall be, whether in death or in life, even there also your servant will be. Look, I'm just going to say, it's great to have people like that. You know what I mean? He's a new guy, but he's like, look, whether you live or die, I'm with you. And David, I think, needed to hear that. He knew that he had the 600 men that are with him. They've already committed that. But even in one of the lowest points of David's life, he's got new guys coming saying that I've heard about you, I know you. This just is a low time. I'm with you through thick and thin. And it's a great thing to have words of confirmation like that. It's a really great thing. You know, I don't want to call Clint out, but Clint emails me and texts me periodically, and he just tells me, dude, I love being at church. I love the Word of God. You have a good week. I don't know why he does it. You know, I'm like, wow, that's so awesome. So I send it back and say, man, I hope you have a good week too. That's so cool. But that's encouraging. You know what I mean? Stuff like that's encouraging. I try to do that to you guys. You know what I mean? I try to think about what, and if you get a random text sometimes from me or from somebody randomly, it's just because we're thinking about you and sending you a text. If you never got one, it doesn't mean I don't love you or care about you. I haven't texted all of y'all, I know. But I do love you as a fellowship, and I'm thankful for you. And it's neat to be unified in something together. You know what I mean? God's called us to this church, not because it's superior to any other church, but because it's our church. Yeah, it's church that we're doing together. He's got things that he's called us to do together. And for me, I say to you, like Ittai to Gittite, I'm with you. You know, whatever God's called you to do, if we can help in some way, let's do it. And when you say the same thing back to me, it's encouraging. You know, and I know this is a whole kingdom with a king and everything, and it's not like that with the church, but the same we're doing something together, and it's encouraging to have each other. David is, I think, thankful to hear this from Ittai the Gittite, and it could have been left out of the Bible. The guy's only there for one day, but I think this is something that the Lord wanted us to remember as we read through it, that it's great to have encouragement, to be encouraged by people that are unified doing the same thing together. Anyways, small little side note. So look at verse number 22. It says, "So David said to Ittai, 'Go on and cross over.' Then Ittai the Gittite and all his men and all the little ones who were with him crossed over, and all the country wept with a loud voice, and all the people crossed over. The king himself crossed over the brook Kidron, and all the people crossed over toward the way of the wilderness." So they're leaving the city, they're crossing over, and then David still, it's a difficult thing being a king or a leader like this, because in the midst of your own mourning and sorrow and difficulty, when a trial like this comes into your life, you still have to lead. You have to make a plan. You still have to think, because people are looking at you. And all of you are a leader in some way. And when the going gets tough, it doesn't mean you can just stop. Everybody needs a break at time, but after the break, you still got to do what needs to be done. And I just want to encourage you in that. David strengthened himself in the Lord many times at low times. I just want to challenge you that too. If you're going through something difficult and you still have to lead, ask God for strength, strengthen yourself in Him, and do whatever needs to be done to lead. And so this is what David does here at this point. Verse number 24 says, "There was also Zadok and all of the Levites who were with him, bearing the ark of the covenant of God, and they set the ark down, the ark of God, and Abiathar went up until all the people had finished crossing over from the city. Then the king said to Zadok, 'Carry the ark back into the city.'" So when David left, the priests were carrying the ark like they're supposed to. One in the front, one in the back. They're holding the poles. They have the ark of God. They walked out, probably standing down in the brook of Kidron, just waiting for them to cross. And then as they begin to cross, the priests come up at the tail end of it after the army has passed by, and David looks at them, and he loves them. He loves the priests that we're speaking of here. He's no doubt spent time with Zadok and Abiathar and spoken with them and talked to them about difficult things that he was having to make decisions on. And he looked at them in this very difficult time of having to leave and says, "I want you to take the ark and I want you to bring it back to the city." Okay? That's where the ark of God belongs. There in the city of Jerusalem. It belongs there. I want you to take it back. But in the process of thinking this through, like I said, as he's leaving, he says, "Carry the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, He will bring me back and show me both it and His dwelling place." So this is what David says. He goes, "Listen, God is judging me and has judged me to the core. I know I've done wrong things, and there are consequences out here because of what I've done. But Zadok and Abiathar, take this back. You know how much I love the ark of God. You remember me dancing as we brought it into the city. I want you to take this back and put it there, and if it's God's will that I ever lay eyes on this again, He will judge me, and then He will bring me back into this city so that I can see it and its dwelling place." Okay, that's what he says. But he says this in verse 26. If I have no delight in you, here I am. Let him do to me as it seems good to him. So David, openly before the priest, this is really important because remember, David's a man after God's own heart, even though he did so many things. And this is another clue in the scriptures of why he is. Because David says, "God, my heart's for you above all things. I love Jerusalem. I love being the king that you made me. But I'm leaving now, and if that's part of the consequence for my actions, and I never get to go back and see this ark of God in your place, Jerusalem, if If I never ever get to do that again, so be it. Whatever God wants is what I'm taking now, because I want you, God. If you never let me do that, but I have you, that's enough. But if I get to go back, praise the Lord, that would be so awesome. Have you ever been in a situation where you really wanted something? David wanted to be back in his city. But he was willing to say, I want you, God, more than this. And if your will is me not to have what I want, I'll take it. Whatever you want to do with me, God, that's what I want. That's a hard place to be if you're real with yourself. I want this, but it seems like you might not want to give me this. So you have to figure, am I going to draw a line in the sand and go, okay, God, I'm happily serving you if I have this. Now, if you take this away, well, then I'm going to be questioning if I'm going to serve you or not. That's not David's heart. David's heart is, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I hope that that's how you see God now. I hope that's how I see God now. Because that's how David sees him. So in that very intense moment, if you have the backdrop that we've tried to set here, all his mighty men have gone by. It's a final conversation before he heads up to the Mount of Olives. They're crying, they're sad. He tells the priest, you guys go back into the city and take this with you. Now, one thing that I want you to know, because David is a military leader, he's still the king, he still has to make a plan. He's let God know, if I never see this again, that's okay. But he knows that he has Zadok's heart and he has Abiathar's heart. They're committed to David. So he says in just a minute, go into the city and you keep an eye on what's going on with Absalom, and you bring word to me. Because he's the leader. He's got to lead all these people. He needs to know what's going on. And so he tells Zadok and Abiathar, send your kids with word of what's going on. So that's how he's still commanding the people and taking control, I think in a godly way. He's still humbly leaving. Verse 26 says, verse 27, the king said to Zadok the priest, are you not a seer? Return to the city in peace, you and your 2 sons with you. And he names the sons, Ahimaaz, your son, and Jonathan, the son of Abiathar. See, I will wait in the plains of the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me. So he's got messengers now in where Absalom will be. Verse 29. Therefore Zadok and Abiathar carried the ark of God back to Jerusalem, and they remained there. I mean, imagine what that would have been like, too, as they begin to climb towards the Mount of Olives, and they're looking back at Jerusalem, and they see Zadok and Abiathar and the ark of God getting smaller and smaller as they head up the hill back into the city. You know, David really, it's uncertain. He doesn't know if God's going to let him go back. He doesn't know if God's going to keep him away forever. He knows there's consequences to his sin, but he doesn't know which of these is that. It's really a tough place that he's in right now, but in the midst of all his unknowns, he's still got to be the leader. It's a very difficult spot that David's in right now. And so listen what happens next. Verse 30. It says, so David went up by the ascent of the Mount of Olives, and he wept as he went up. And he had his head covered and went barefoot. And all the people who were with him covered their heads and went up, weeping as they went up. Verse 31. Then someone told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. Okay? I know, that had to have been heavy. After all that, he's walking up, he's down. This is going to be like kicking him when he's down. But as a leader, if you have all the information, it's better than not. The guy who told this wasn't trying to kick David when he's down. He's trying to give him the information, because all these people were committed to David that were going up there with him. And so he walks over probably quietly with their hoods down. He leans in and he says, I just want you to know, you saw all the people go by here. Ahithophel's not here. Ahithophel has sided with Absalom, and it's confirmed. And so David's heart probably sank even more because, listen, Ahithophel was one of the wisest men that David knew. Most godly counsel that David had prior to this came through his lips. This guy was, people have written about this guy that it was almost like hearing God speak when he was tuned in with, because he just spoke godly wisdom to David, this guy Ahithophel. But as godly as he was, when he was sinned against by David, he was tempted by the enemy, like I said before, to withdraw and let it fester. Even with all the wisdom of God, knowing that that's not what he should do, that's what he does. And it changes him into a bitter, revenge-seeking man. That's what it does. Now listen, you can kind of look at it and go, well, I can't blame the guy. You know what David did to him? Killed his son-in-law and took his his granddaughter. Yes, that's true, but at the same time, David really repented before God. And consequences came his way because of his actions. Ahithophel did not know any of that and couldn't be there for that whole godly union that could have happened of forgiveness and restoration and repentance. So he knows nothing of that, like I mentioned before. So that's kind of the scene that's set, and David hears Ahithophel is among the conspirators. And David said, this is what David says when he hears that, "O Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." David can do nothing else, really. So he just asks God, like a Hail Mary throw. You know what I mean? Like a bomb of a throw. Please, please, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Would you please do that? He doesn't know if God's going to do it or not. Listen to what happens. Verse 32. Now it happened when David had come to the top of the mountain where he worshiped God, there was Hushai. This is a really awesome guy, too. And I know there are a lot of names, but if you can remember these and somehow categorize them in your mind with whose side they're on and what's going on, it'll flesh out the rest of this as we go through it a lot better. There's this guy named Hushai the Archite. And he's coming to meet him with his robe torn and dust on his head. That means that he is united with David. He's mourning. His robe is torn, dust on his head. He comes with David. And David said to him, "Hushai, if you go on with me, then you will become a burden to me." That makes me think that Hushai was probably older, probably in the counsel of wisdom coming from Ahithophel, but inferior to Ahithophel previously with the wisdom. Okay? But he says, "Hushai, if you come with me, you're going to be a burden. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, 'I will be your servant, O king, as I was your father's servant previously, so I will now be your servant also,' then you may defeat the counsel of Ahithophel for me." Do you follow what's happening? This guy is committed to David just like Zadok the priest and Abiathar. Now there's a guy named Hushai who has the ability to speak to Absalom as a wise man. Okay? Just like Ahithophel, but not as wise. But David's prayed and said, turn the counsel of Ahithophel to foolishness. And so he begins to convince and really request, I think, less convince Hushai to go in there. And he says this, "And do you not have Zadok and Abiathar the priests who will be there with you?" So Hushai's like, "Okay, you're asking me to go to the enemy's camp. Okay, I can do that." He goes, "Listen, you have Zadok and Abiathar there with you." Can you imagine what it would be like to be that guy? You don't want to be in there. He's the enemy. Your heart's not with him. You're going to have to fake it while you're there and be a full-on actor, but you've got Zadok and Abiathar the priest. Y'all can get together and go, "Oh, God, help us," and plan this out. But y'all go work it out and be spies for me. That's a lot David's asking. But for their king, they're willing to do it. He says, therefore, it will be that whatever you hear from the king's house, you shall tell Zadok and Abiathar the priests. Indeed, they have with them their 2 sons. I don't know how to say his name. Ahimaaz, Zadok's son, and Jonathan, Abiathar's son. And by them you shall send every message, everything you hear to me. So you see how David's still leading in the midst of this difficulty. He's set up spies with runners and a godly guy that can come up against Ahithophel's counsel. And he's got it set up, but he still doesn't know how the outcome's going to be. He's just got to sit out and wait. Okay? In the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus later would sweat great drops of blood. That's a tough place right there, the Garden of Gethsemane. I've heard that there's some really old olive trees there, and it's just an interesting place to say the least. That is where David's going for all this. So listen what happens now. It says, so Hushai, David's friend, it's cool, I circled that in my Bible because you know where his allegiance lies. It's David's friend. Went into the city, and Absalom came into Jerusalem. So get your picture going. You know what's happening on David's side. On Absalom's side, they're coming in with excitement. His 200 men plus other people, the chariots, and all the people were so happy that he's told at the city gates, if I was only the judge, you would have this. So all the people were so excited, and he's coming in. It's like a party. And then you got mourning on this side, and then you have the spies going in, and the whole scene's being set for what's about to happen. Remember, there are 10 concubines left to watch the house. Remember that for a future message. Okay? But something happens here on David's way out. We're going to close the message with this. And it's probably about another 10 minutes or so. But it's very important. I want you to listen to this. And it goes back to the first point. Anytime a message that is verse by verse through the scriptures like we've been going, and it hasn't been created to happen, it's interesting that the point being made, especially if it's being made twice, is something that we should listen to. Okay? The beginning, just to remind you, between Ahithophel and David, Ahithophel didn't listen. He went away when the offense happened and let it fester. Okay? Remember that. If he would have communicated, even though David did sin against him, that helps a relationship move forward. In this situation that we're about to read, there's going to be a few more people that you need to remember their names. One guy named Ziba is a liar, and he's trying to cause problems between David and somebody else. Satan, follow me here, is a liar. You can connect him with Ziba in this. He will do this. If something looks a certain way, okay, from this guy's perspective, from this guy's perspective, it may not be that way. It could have been set up by Ziba or the enemy. And listen, if the enemy whispers into, and this happens a lot, it's spiritual warfare with friends and Christians and leaders and workers and people of the church, and it just happens because the enemy doesn't, especially husbands and wives, like the enemy doesn't want godliness and communication to happen. So Ziba in this situation is like the enemy. Okay? Watch what happens here. And another person that you need to know is Mephibosheth. I'm not going to ask you, but hopefully you remember him. That is Jonathan, David's good friend, who was King Saul's son from years ago. Remember, he got dropped, if you remember that, by the nurse when they were trying to get out of town. He was crippled, and he lived such a poor life. Well, when David found out that there was this kid that now has grown up that's been poor his whole life, David welcomed him into his house, showed him kindness and love, let him eat from his own table, gave him land, and then he put Ziba as the servant under Mephibosheth. Okay? That happened weeks ago, if you remember that. Well, when that happened, Mephibosheth was given so many great gifts from David, and Mephibosheth and David had a really good relationship after that. David showed kindness, and Mephibosheth talked to him at his table. Now, Ziba, I'm just trying to paint the picture, like the enemy, okay, here's what he does. He's like, okay, there's a rebellion happening. How can I make good for myself during this? Well, if I can turn what David gave Mephibosheth, all the land and all the things, into my own, oh, that would be awesome. Because we got a new king coming in, and then the king will just know that is my land and my stuff. That would be so awesome. So what he does is Ziba, like the enemy, comes in between a relationship of two people and whispers false things into one of them about the other one. And listen what happens. It puts a wedge between these two people. And the only thing that will fix that is communication. What will hurt it is like Ahithophel just leaving and not allowing it to be fixed. If you just believe something that seems right, please follow me because this applies to every relationship. If you believe something that seems right, it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, but I'm telling you, most of the time it's a duck, but sometimes it's not a duck. And the only way that you know it's not a duck, and the enemy's been doing this to hurt a relationship, the only way is communication for that to be taken care of. Do you follow what I'm saying? And mostly it happens between a husband and a wife that aren't willing to communicate for whatever reason or don't think they need to communicate. Please, just talk is what God desires, that we communicate. Well, listen to what happens in this story. I'll read it. We'll finish up. Just very important point that God's made twice in this message. Verse number 16, or chapter 16, verse 1 says, when David was a little past the top of the mountain, there was Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, who met him with a couple of saddled donkeys, and on them 200 loaves of bread, 100 clusters of raisins, 100 summer fruits, and skins of wine. And the king said to Ziba, what do you mean with these things? And Ziba said, the donkeys are for the king's household to ride on, the bread and the summer fruit are for the young men to eat, and the wine and those who are faint to drink in the wilderness. And the king said, where's your master's son? Okay, so listen what happened here. Ziba has to figure out, how can I bring some weight to the fact that I want him to believe me? So what he does is he brings all this stuff to King David. The devil brings it all to King David and says, look at all this stuff that we're giving you right now. And then so David's like, that's awesome. He thinks it's from Mephibosheth. Okay, he thinks it's from Mephibosheth. And so he asks the question, where's your servant? I mean, where's let me just read it. I don't know what it says exactly. It says, the king says, where is your master's son? Okay, so his master, okay, where's your master's son? Talking about King Saul, because Ziba used to be with King Saul. So he says, where's your master's son? Speaking of Jonathan, which was actually his grandson. Where is Mephibosheth, is what he's basically saying. Where is he? Because all these gifts surely came from him. I gave him all the wealth and everything. Where is it? And then this is what he says. I'm going to paraphrase it, and then I'll read it. He says this, well, there's some bad news from the home front. Ziba says this, really bad news, King David. He has rebelled against you, and now what he thinks is, Mephibosheth, King Saul's grandson, he thinks that it's the perfect time. When there's a civil war going on, maybe you and Absalom will just fight it out until you kill each other, and then he can bring back the kingdom of Saul, and Mephibosheth will be king. Now listen, here's what David, when he heard that lie, that seems logical. Okay, it seems pretty logical. David's had so many other people, and Ahithophel and other people included, turn their back on him. Now Mephibosheth, the guy that I gave all the kindness to, par for the course. You know, that's what David's thinking. I mean, all this stuff here, Ziba's bringing it. Why would he do that? But he's not really in his rational mind because of all the bad things that are happening to have the wisdom of God to see this lie. So he just believes it. He just believes the lie because it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck. Listen, many times If something seems a certain way, it is, but sometimes it's not. And the only way to know is to have communication with Mephibosheth. Later, he's going to have that and find out the truth. But until that, I want you to tell him what he does. He believes Ziba. Mephibosheth hasn't done anything. I want you to follow this now. Listen to me. Mephibosheth, how do you think that's going to make him feel? Like, I gave you my life, King David. Why would you believe a lie against me? I was your trusted friend. I was there with you. But David believed the lies of the enemy. Now it could make Mephibosheth feel like, how could you do that to me? Like, why would you think I would betray you? I mean, how would that feel if you were that person? Well, we'll figure that out later as Mephibosheth comes to him in another message. But David quickly just believes the lies rather than communicating. And I think that's the point that God wants to drive home, because it happened with Ahithophel, and now it's happened with Ziba. Bottom line, relationships are super important, especially friends, especially marriages, especially relationships between bosses and employees, church people. Please, if there's issues, the best way to handle it is to go to the source and just talk. Just talk. And usually, the thing that seemed so sure that it's a duck, when all the pieces come together, you realize, wow, the enemy was in that and made it look like a duck, and it wasn't a duck. I am so sorry that I was tempted to believe that, but I'm so glad that we talked. That's what needs to be happening. That, I think, is what God's speaking through this crazy little microcosm of a look down into David's life. I think that's what he's speaking to us as a fellowship right now. So if you got issues with somebody, before you just be the judge, jury, and sign them up for the hanging, make sure you talk to them first. And then if they have done it, then deal with it. But maybe, just maybe, you got a situation where the enemy's trying to hurt a relationship and none of it's true. Okay? Because he's real good at doing that, I'm telling you. He's real good at doing that, especially between a husband and a wife. All right, let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for the word today. Thank you for teaching us through it. I pray, Lord, that we would be